Welcome to Boring History at Sleep. Tonight, we are going somewhere ancient, somewhere strange, somewhere so old that when Julius Caesar visited Egypt, the pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,500 years old. Egypt was ancient even to the ancients. We're talking about one of the longest-lasting civilizations in all of human history. The ancient Egyptian state endured for roughly 3,000 years, from around 3100 BC to 30 BC, when the last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, died and Egypt became a Roman province. 3,000 years. For perspective, the United States of America has existed for less than 250 years. Ancient Egypt outlasted us by a factor of 12. So settle in. Let the narration wash over you. This story has everything: god kings and slave builders, military empires and catastrophic invasions, mummies and murder, romance and betrayal, monuments so massive they're still standing after 4 millennia. Egypt is not a boring story, but we tell it in a way that helps you relax, breathe slowly, and maybe drift off to sleep somewhere around the reign of Thutmose III. Tonight on Boring History at Sleep, we are telling the complete story of ancient Egypt, from the very first settlers along the Nile all the way to the last pharaoh and the Roman conquest. 2 hours, one civilization. Let's begin. The Nile River is the foundation of everything. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. The river flows north from the highlands of East Africa, from Lake Victoria and the Ethiopian highlands, through nearly 7,000 kilometers of desert and rock, before fanning out into its great delta and emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. It is one of the longest rivers on Earth, and for thousands of years it was the most important. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, called Egypt the gift of the Nile. It was not a metaphor, it was a precise description of geological reality. Every year, from roughly June to September, the Nile flooded. The floodwaters covered the agricultural land on either side of the river, depositing a layer of rich, dark, extraordinarily fertile silt. When the waters receded, they left behind soil so productive that Egyptian farmers could grow 2 or sometimes 3 crops a year in a land that was otherwise almost entirely desert. This annual flood, called the inundation, was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. The Egyptians divided the entire year into 3 seasons built around it: Akhet, the flooding season; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. Their entire agricultural and administrative calendar revolved around the Nile's rhythm. The predictability of this flood was itself a gift. Unlike the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, which flooded unpredictably and often destructively, the Nile flooded on a reliable schedule. Egyptian farmers knew when it was coming. They built their villages on higher ground, planted when the water receded, and harvested before the next flood arrived. This reliability allowed the development of complex, long-range planning, the foundation of civilization. Egypt also benefited from remarkable natural defenses. To the east and west, vast deserts, the eastern desert running to the Red Sea, The Sahara, stretching endlessly to the west, made invasion nearly impossible from those directions. To the north, the marshy, confusing channels of the Nile Delta slowed any naval invasion. To the south, cataracts, stretches of rapids and rocks in the Nile, blocked easy navigation. Egypt was a natural fortress. Within this fortress, the Egyptians developed a culture of remarkable sophistication and extraordinary continuity. Ideas, art styles, religious practices, and administrative forms established in 3000 BC were still recognizable 2,500 years later. No other civilization in history has maintained such consistent cultural identity for so long. People have been living along the Nile for tens of thousands of years before the pharaohs. Hunter-gatherers following game, nomadic herders moving cattle along the river's edge, fishermen in papyrus reed boats. Slowly, around 5000 BC, 7,000 years ago, settled agricultural communities began to take hold in both Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt, confusingly, is the southern part of Egypt. Upper because the Nile flows north, so upstream is south. Lower Egypt is the northern part, the Delta region closest to the Mediterranean. This geographic distinction between Upper and Lower Egypt would be fundamental to Egyptian identity for the entire 3,000-year history of the civilization. By around 3500 BC, two distinct cultural traditions had emerged: the Naqada culture in Upper Egypt and various Delta cultures in Lower Egypt. They traded, interacted, and competed. Chieftains led communities. Warfare between communities was common. Artistic traditions developed: pottery with painted geometric designs, stone palettes for grinding cosmetics, figurines of animals and humans. We can see in these pre-dynastic remains the seeds of everything that would define Egyptian civilization: the distinctive artistic style with its flat profile and hierarchical scaling, the religious imagery of gods in animal form, the obsession with the afterlife, the skilled craftsmanship in stone, faience, and precious metals. Egypt did not spring fully formed from nowhere. It grew over millennia from these early communities. The pre-dynastic period also shows us something important about Egyptian religion from the very beginning. Death mattered enormously. Pre-dynastic burials were careful, deliberate, and often elaborate. The dead were buried with food, tools, and personal objects they might need in the afterlife. Animals were sometimes sacrificed and buried alongside humans. The Egyptian belief in an eternal afterlife, reachable through proper burial rituals, was not an invention of the pharaohs. It was already ancient when the first pharaoh appeared. Around 3100 BC, something extraordinary happened. Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under a single ruler. This is one of the most significant political events in human history, the creation of the world's first large-scale territorial state. And it happened so long ago that even the Egyptians themselves, centuries later, weren't entirely sure of the details. The traditional story credits a king named Narmer, or possibly Menes, the names may refer to the same person, with conquering Lower Egypt and uniting the two lands under one crown. The Narmer palette, one of the most famous objects from ancient Egypt, shows a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt smiting an enemy, and on the other side wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt inspecting slain enemies. It is essentially an advertisement of unification, carved in stone around 3100 BC. Whether unification happened in a single dramatic conquest or through gradual political absorption is debated. The archaeological evidence suggests it may have been a process unfolding over generations, with the Naqada culture of Upper Egypt gradually expanding northward and absorbing the Delta cultures. But the symbolic importance of unification was enormous, and Egyptians celebrated it as the foundational event of their civilization for 3,000 years. The new unified kingdom needed a capital, and the first pharaohs chose Memphis, located near the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, strategically positioned to control both. Memphis would remain one of Egypt's most important cities for millennia. The pharaoh wore a double crown that combined the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, a walking symbol of unity. His titles always included King of Upper and Lower Egypt. The duality of the two lands was always present. This first dynasty and the second are called the early dynastic period, lasting roughly 3100 to 2686 BC. These early pharaohs, with names like Aha, Dir, Den, and Ka, were buried at Abydos in elaborate mud brick tombs filled with grave goods. Some of their servants and officials were killed and buried with them, a practice that would be abandoned in later periods, thankfully, but which tells us something about the extraordinary power these early god kings claimed.
The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly 2686 to 2181 BC, is one of the most extraordinary periods in all of human history. This is the age of the Great Pyramids, those impossible triangles of stone that have defined Egypt's image for 4,000 years. The civilization that built them was already ancient, and yet what they accomplished still defies easy explanation. The third dynasty pharaoh Djoser, ruling around 2650 BC, commissioned his chief architect Imhotep to build him an eternal home. Imhotep, a man of such genius that he was deified after his death and worshipped as a god of medicine for thousands of years, invented the stepped pyramid. At Saqqara, still standing today, the step pyramid of Djoser rises in 6 unequal tiers to a height of 62 meters. It was the first large-scale stone structure in human history. Nothing like it had ever been built before. But Djoser's pyramid was just the beginning. Within a few generations, Egyptian architects had made the conceptual leap from stepped pyramid to true pyramid. 4 smooth, angled faces rising to a perfect point. The fourth dynasty pharaoh Sneferu built 3 pyramids while apparently still alive, experimenting and refining the form. His bent pyramid shows the correction mid-construction. The angle was changed partway up because the structure was becoming unstable. Sneferu learned. His son would perfect. That son was Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. Around 2560 BC, Khufu ordered the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is 146 meters tall, the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until Lincoln Cathedral in England was built in the 14th century AD. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 to 15 tons. It is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree, more precise than any modern building. The interior chambers and passageways are works of extraordinary engineering. How was it built? Not by slaves, as Hollywood long assumed. Archaeological evidence from the workers' village at Giza shows a well-organized, well-fed workforce of skilled craftsmen and laborers, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 at peak construction, who worked in rotating teams, were given medical care, and were buried with honor when they died on the job. Building the pyramid was apparently a civic and religious honor, not a punishment. The workers even left graffiti calling their teams names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure.
Beside the Great Pyramid stands the Great Sphinx, the largest monolithic statue on Earth, carved from a single outcrop of limestone on the Giza Plateau. Its human head, believed to represent Pharaoh Khafre, rises above a lion's body 73 meters long and 20 meters high. The Sphinx gazes eternally eastward, watching the sunrise. It has been doing this for approximately 4,500 years. The pyramids of Giza, Khufu's Great Pyramid, Khafre's slightly smaller but higher-positioned pyramid, and Menkaure's comparatively modest pyramid, were not just tombs, they were cosmic machines. Their alignment, their proportions, their relationship to the stars, especially to the constellation Orion associated with the god Osiris, were all deliberate. The pyramid complex was a city of the dead, a place where the pharaoh's Ka, his spiritual double, could transition from this world to the eternal realm of the gods. The religious framework behind the pyramids centered on the sun god Ra, later merged with Amun to become Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was the son of Ra, the god Horus incarnate on earth. When he died, he became Osiris, king of the dead. His successor became the new Horus. This divine kingship was the ideological foundation of the entire Egyptian state. The pharaoh was not a man who ruled on behalf of the gods, he was a god who had temporarily taken human form. The solar temples and pyramid complexes of the Old Kingdom expressed this theology in stone. The smooth, angled sides of the pyramid were interpreted as rays of sunlight made permanent, the pharaoh ascending to the sky on a beam of sunlight. The pyramid texts inscribed inside some pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties contain the oldest religious texts in the world, spells, hymns, and instructions to guide the dead pharaoh through the underworld and into eternal life with the gods. Life in the Old Kingdom, for those not building pyramids, was highly organized. A professional bureaucracy of scribes administered the country. Taxes were collected in grain. Craftsmen produced extraordinary works of art in stone, wood, faience, and precious metals. Egyptian medicine, already sophisticated, produced some of the earliest medical texts in history. Trade expeditions sailed to Punt, possibly modern Somalia or Eritrea, for incense and exotic animals. Caravans crossed Sinai for copper and turquoise.
Nothing lasts forever. The Old Kingdom ended around 2181 BC in collapse, not from foreign invasion, but from a combination of internal political fragmentation, climate change, and famine. A prolonged drought reduced the Nile's annual flood, causing crop failures and famine across Egypt. The central government, already weakened by powerful regional governors called nomarchs, who had accumulated hereditary power and wealth, could no longer maintain order or feed the population. The first intermediate period, roughly 2181 to 2055 BC, is a time that later Egyptians looked back on with horror. Ancient texts describe famines so severe that people resorted to cannibalism. Tombs were robbed, even royal ones. Local warlords fought each other for resources. The ideological certainty of divine kingship, the pharaoh as cosmic guarantor of order, Ma'at, the principle of harmony and justice, had been shattered. But the first intermediate period was not simply darkness. Regional centers flourished in new ways. Art styles diversified as local workshops experimented without the constraining influence of the royal court at Memphis. Ordinary people gained access to religious texts and funerary practices previously reserved for royalty. The democratization of death historians call it. The strict hierarchy of the Old Kingdom had cracked, and through the cracks, new possibilities emerged. Two rival power centers eventually emerged, Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. Their rivalry would last for decades, fought in a series of civil wars up and down the Nile. The Theban rulers, the 11th dynasty, had the advantages of a strong regional power base, aggressive military leadership, and perhaps the support of Amun's powerful priesthood at Karnak. Around 2055 BC, the Theban pharaoh Mentuhotep II completed the reunification of Egypt, defeating the Heracleopolitan rulers and restoring centralized rule. Egypt entered the Middle Kingdom, a period that later Egyptians often regarded as a golden age, a time when the best aspects of Old Kingdom civilization were restored and refined. The Middle Kingdom, roughly 2055 to 1650 BC, is often called Egypt's Classical Age, the period when Egyptian literature, art, and culture reached perhaps its highest refinement. The literature of the Middle Kingdom was considered the standard of classical Egyptian for over 1,000 years afterward. Scribes in the New Kingdom copied Middle Kingdom texts as exercises in elegant writing. The most famous Middle Kingdom literary work is the story of Sinuhe, the tale of an Egyptian official who flees Egypt after the death of Pharaoh Amenemhat I, lives abroad in Canaan and Syria for years, and eventually returns home to die in Egypt. It's a meditation on identity, exile, the meaning of home, and the irresistible pull of one's native land. It reads, surprisingly, almost like a modern novel. It was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, Egypt's most beloved story. Middle Kingdom pharaohs were also great builders and conquerors. They pushed Egypt's southern border deep into Nubia, the territory to the south, roughly corresponding to modern Sudan, building a chain of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile to control trade and resources. Nubian gold, ivory, cattle, and slaves flowed north into Egypt. Egyptian culture flowed south into Nubia. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was complex, sometimes exploitative, sometimes deeply intertwined, and would remain so for the rest of Egyptian history. The Middle Kingdom also saw increased contact with the Near East. Egyptian trade goods appear in the Levant, Cyprus, and Crete. Near Eastern goods and peoples appear in Egypt. The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, another Middle Kingdom masterwork, shows a sophisticated society wrestling with questions of justice, corruption, and the obligations of power, themes that feel strikingly contemporary. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom presented themselves differently from the god-kings of the Old Kingdom. Portraits show careworn, realistic faces, lined, tired, human. They emphasize their role as shepherds of their people, responsible for the well-being of every Egyptian, not just cosmic forces indifferent to ordinary life. This more personal conception of kingship may reflect lessons learned from the chaos of the First Intermediate Period.
The Middle Kingdom ended in the Second Intermediate Period, another era of fragmentation, this time from both internal weakness and, for the first time in Egyptian history, successful foreign conquest. Around 1650 BC, a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, had taken control of much of Lower Egypt and established their own dynasty at a city called Avaris in the Delta. The Hyksos were a Semitic people from the Levant, modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria,
who had been migrating into Egypt gradually over generations before making a political move. Later Egyptian propaganda portrayed the Hyksos invasion as a sudden, violent catastrophe. Modern archaeology suggests it was actually a slower, more complex process, but the result was the same. Foreigners ruled northern Egypt for about a century, and it traumatized Egyptian cultural memory for generations. The Hyksos were not simply destructive invaders. They introduced Egypt to revolutionary military technology, the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow made of multiple materials for greater power and range, new types of bronze weapons and armor. Before the Hyksos, Egypt had no horses. Before the Hyksos, Egyptian armies fought on foot with simple bows and copper weapons. The Hyksos literally upgraded Egypt's military. But the psychological wound was deep. Egypt, protected by its deserts, confident in the favor of its gods, ruled by divine pharaohs, had been conquered. The ideological certainty of divine protection had failed. When Egyptian rulers from Thebes eventually began pushing the Hyksos back, they fought with a burning fury fed by humiliation. The new kingdom pharaohs who emerged from this conflict would build Egypt's greatest military empire, partly because they had learned, painfully, that walls of sand were not enough. The liberation war against the Hyksos began with the Theban pharaoh Seqenenre-Ptah, whose mummy shows catastrophic head wounds from axes and daggers, wounds that match Hyksos weapons. He apparently died fighting. His son, Kamose, continued the war, and his successor, Ahmose I, completed the expulsion of the Hyksos around 1550 BC, founding the 18th dynasty and beginning the New Kingdom, the most spectacular era in all of Egyptian history. The New Kingdom, spanning roughly 1550 to 1070 BC, is when Egypt became an empire in the modern sense, a military power that projected force beyond its borders, controlled foreign territories through garrison and governor, and extracted tribute from subject peoples across the Near East and deep into Africa. It is also the period of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, its most spectacular monuments, and its most dramatic stories. Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom, did not stop after expelling the Hyksos. He pursued them into Canaan, campaigned in Nubia, and established the administrative structures that would support imperial expansion. His successors continued the work. Amenhotep I pushed further into Nubia. Thutmose I, one of Egypt's most aggressive military pharaohs, campaigned as far north as the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia, erecting a victory stele on the river's bank as a statement of power that would have been unimaginable to pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. The New Kingdom pharaohs built on a scale that makes even the Old Kingdom pyramids seem modest in terms of geographic ambition. They constructed enormous temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, the ancient city of Thebes, now Egypt's religious capital. Karnak, in particular, was a project that took over 1,500 years to build, with each pharaoh adding pylons, obelisks, halls, and chapels in a vast accumulation of royal piety and propaganda. The hypostyle hall at Karnak, a forest of 134 massive columns, the tallest reaching 24 meters, covering an area the size of a football field, is still the largest room of any religious building ever constructed. The relationship between the pharaohs and the priesthood of Amun at Karnak was central to New Kingdom politics. The priests of Amun accumulated enormous wealth and influence. They managed the gods' estates, vast agricultural lands, workshops, and trade fleets.
By the late New Kingdom, the priesthood of Amun would control roughly 1/3 of all Egypt's cultivated land and a quarter of its population. This was not yet a problem in the early New Kingdom, but the seeds of a future crisis were being planted. Egypt's New Kingdom empire at its height stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in modern Sudan to the upper Euphrates in modern Syria. Egyptian garrisons held cities in Canaan. Vassal kings of Nubia, Libya, and the Levant sent tribute to Thebes. Nubian gold and Levantine copper funded the building boom. And at the center of all this was an institution, the pharaonic state, of extraordinary efficiency and ideological power.
Among all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, one stands out as perhaps the most remarkable simply because of who she was. Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled Egypt as pharaoh for roughly 20 years in the 15th century BC, and who was so successful that her successors tried to erase her from history entirely. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, one of Egypt's great warrior kings. When Thutmose II died around 1479 BC, the heir was his young son Thutmose III, born of a secondary wife. Hatshepsut, as the king's great wife and daughter of the previous pharaoh, became regent, ruling on behalf of the young king. But somewhere around 1473 BC, she took the extraordinary step of declaring herself co-pharaoh. She wore the double crown. She wore the false beard that was part of pharaonic regalia. She was depicted in sculpture and painting as a male pharaoh with male pronouns in some inscriptions, though in others she is unambiguously female. Why did she do it? The simple answer is probably ambition and ability. She was clearly very good at ruling. Her reign was marked not by military conquest, though she did conduct some campaigns, but by something equally valuable: trade. Her most famous expeditions sent 5 ships south along the African coast to the mysterious land of Punt, returning with incense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. The reliefs depicting this expedition on her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari are among the finest art produced in ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut also built prolifically. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, 3 colonnaded terraces rising against the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, is considered one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world. She erected 2 enormous obelisks at Karnak, their tips sheathed in electrum, an alloy of gold and silver that caught the sunlight and could be seen from miles away. She described her building program in characteristic Egyptian royal style. "I have done these things by the device of my heart. I have never slumbered as one forgetful, but have made firm what was decayed." After Hatshepsut's death around 1458 BC, Thutmose III ruled alone, and he became one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs. Decades later, someone, possibly Thutmose III, possibly his son Amenhotep II, systematically defaced Hatshepsut's images and inscriptions, removing her name and replacing it or leaving blank spaces. For 3,000 years, she was lost to history. It was only in the 19th century AD, as scholars learned to read hieroglyphics and began systematically excavating Egypt, that Hatshepsut's story was reconstructed and her rightful place in history restored. Once free of Hatshepsut's long shadow, Thutmose III proved to be the greatest military commander in Egyptian history, possibly the greatest in all of ancient history before Alexander the Great.
In 17 military campaigns over 2 decades, he expanded Egypt's empire to its maximum extent and fought battles that military historians still study today. His first and most celebrated campaign came in 1457 BC at the Battle of Megiddo, a city in Canaan that sits at a strategic mountain pass where armies have fought from the Bronze Age to World War I. A coalition of Canaanite city-states led by the king of Kadesh had rebelled against Egyptian authority. Thutmose III moved his army north through Sinai and arrived at the hills overlooking Megiddo. His generals advised the cautious route around the hills. Thutmose III chose the direct route, a narrow mountain pass through which his army would have to march in single file, dangerously vulnerable to ambush. It was a calculated risk. Either the enemy expected the direct approach and had prepared an ambush, in which case the army would be destroyed, or they expected the cautious approach and had concentrated their forces elsewhere. Thutmose III gambled and won. He emerged from the pass to find the enemy army still moving to meet him from the wrong direction. He routed them and drove them back into Megiddo's walls. After a 7-month siege, the city fell. Thutmose III recorded his campaigns in meticulous detail in the Annals inscribed on the walls of Karnak, the most complete military records surviving from the ancient world. He lists booty taken, cities captured, tribute received. He fought from Nubia to Syria, taking 350 cities over the course of his reign. He turned Egypt from a regional power into a genuine superpower with an empire spanning 2 continents. He was also a man of culture. He was an accomplished athlete and hunter. He was interested in botany. A room in Karnak known as the Botanical Garden contains reliefs of exotic plants and animals from his campaigns, a pharaoh's nature journal carved in stone. He collected art. He reorganized Egypt's administrative structures to manage his empire efficiently. Military genius alone did not sustain Egypt's empire. Administrative competence was equally essential. By the reign of Amenhotep III, ruling from roughly 1388 to 1351 BC, Egypt was the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. The wars of conquest were largely won, the empire was established, the tribute flowed in, and Amenhotep III, sometimes called the Magnificent, turned all that wealth into an astonishing building program and a court of such luxury that foreign kings wrote to him as equals and begged for his gold. The Amarna letters, a remarkable archive of clay tablets discovered in the late 19th century, preserved the diplomatic correspondence of Amenhotep III and his son with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, Cyprus, and the city-states of Canaan. These letters, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age, give us an extraordinary window into international relations 3,400 years ago. Kings address each other as "my brother." They negotiate marriages, exchange gifts, request gold. "Gold is like dust in your land," writes one Babylonian king to Amenhotep III. "Send me much gold." The confidence of this request tells us everything about Egypt's reputation. Amenhotep III built on a scale that even his militaristic predecessors had not matched. His mortuary temple on the West Bank at Thebes was the largest ever built, so large that almost nothing of it survives because later pharaohs cannibalized its stones for their own projects. All that remains are 2 enormous seated statues, the Colossi of Memnon, that once flanked the temple's entrance. Each is 18 meters tall, weighing 720 tons, carved from single blocks of quartzite. He built a vast pleasure palace at Malkata, with its own harbor capable of hosting his ceremonial barge. He created an artificial lake 3.6 kilometers long and 1.2 kilometers wide for his chief wife Tia to sail on. He commissioned hundreds of statues of himself, dozens of sphinxes, temple additions at Karnak, Luxor, and across Nubia. He celebrated 3 Jubilee festivals, Sed festivals, meant to ritually renew the king's divine power during his long reign. Amenhotep III was also an intellectual. He seems to have been deeply interested in theology and the changes in religious thought during his reign, a growing emphasis on the solar disk, the Aten, as a divine force, foreshadowed the extraordinary religious revolution that his son would unleash on Egypt. If ancient Egypt produced one figure who could be called genuinely revolutionary, a person who tried to change not just policies, but the entire conceptual foundation of civilization, that person was Akhenaten. For 17 years, roughly 1351 to 1334 BC, this strange, visionary pharaoh attempted to overturn 3,000 years of Egyptian religion and replace it with something entirely new. Born Amenhotep IV, he began his reign in conventional fashion, worshipping the traditional Egyptian gods and building at Karnak. But within the first few years of his reign, he made a series of decisions that would shock Egypt to its foundations. He announced that there was only one God, not the traditional pantheon of dozens of deities, but a single divine power, the Aten, the disk of the sun itself, the pure physical energy of sunlight. Not Ra, the sun god with his human face and divine mythology. The Aten was beyond human form, beyond mythology, accessible only through the pharaoh himself. He changed his name from Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. He ordered the closure of the traditional temples. He dispatched workers to chisel out the name of Amun wherever it appeared in inscriptions throughout Egypt. He moved the entire capital of Egypt, the royal court, the administration, the artists, the craftsmen, the soldiers, to a brand new city he built in the desert of Middle Egypt. He called it Akhet Aten, Horizon of the Aten. Modern archaeologists call it Amarna. Amarna was built in just a few years on virgin desert ground, a complete city conjured from nothing. At its center was a great temple to the Aten, open to the sky, through which the sun's rays could shine directly without mediation. Akhenaten composed a beautiful hymn to the Aten, the Great Hymn to the Aten, that bears a striking resemblance to Psalm 104 in the Bible, leading some scholars to speculate about connections to early Hebrew monotheism. Whether or not that connection is real, the Great Hymn to the Aten is one of the most beautiful religious poems to survive from antiquity. Akhenaten's religious revolution was also deeply personal. The art of the Amarna period breaks all conventions of Egyptian aesthetics. Instead of idealized formal images of traditional Egyptian art, Amarna art shows a strange, almost surrealist style. Elongated skulls, wide hips, soft bodies, intimate family scenes. Akhenaten is shown bouncing his daughter on his knee, nuzzling his wife under the rays of the Aten. It is unlike anything else in Egyptian art, naturalistic, even tender, in a tradition that had always prized formal grandeur over intimate family.
Beside Akhenaten throughout his revolution stood his chief wife, Nefertiti, whose name means "the beautiful one has come." Nefertiti was not a passive consort. She appears in Amarna art at almost equal scale to Akhenaten himself, performing religious rituals, driving a chariot, smiting enemies in a pose reserved for pharaohs. Some scholars believe she may have ruled as pharaoh herself for a period after Akhenaten's death, under the name Neferneferu Aten. Her famous painted limestone bust, discovered in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna and now in Berlin's Egyptian Museum, is perhaps the most reproduced image from ancient Egypt. Its extraordinary quality and the sculptor's decision to leave one eye blank, whether intentionally or unfinished, gives it an eerie, otherworldly quality. Nefertiti's face has become the face of ancient Egypt in popular imagination. Akhenaten died around 1334 BC, his death as mysterious as his life. Two short-lived rulers followed, possibly Nefertiti under another name, and possibly Akhenaten's own son, Smenkhkare. Then came a pharaoh so famous that his name is known to almost everyone on earth, despite the fact that he died at approximately 18 years old and accomplished almost nothing of historical significance: Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun is famous not for what he did, but for what happened to his tomb. When the British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered it in the Valley of the Kings in 1922, intact, unlooted, packed to the ceiling with over 5,000 objects of staggering beauty, it became the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The golden death mask of Tutankhamun, weighing 11 kilograms of solid gold inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and obsidian, is the most recognizable face from antiquity. In life, Tutankhamun was significant primarily as the symbol of the counter-revolution. He reversed Akhenaten's religious reforms, restored the old gods, reopened the temples, moved the capital back to Thebes, changed his name from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He was probably a puppet of his advisors, particularly the general Horemheb and the vizier Ai. He died young, possibly from malaria and bone disease, possibly from a chariot accident, and then someone, probably Horemheb, systematically erased him and Akhenaten from the official records of pharaohs. The heretic king and his child successor were deleted from history. After the chaos of the Amarna period, Egypt stabilized under the 19th dynasty and produced the most famous individual pharaoh in Egyptian history, Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, who ruled from approximately 1279 to 1213 BC. His reign of 66 years was the second longest of any Egyptian pharaoh, and he used every year of it to inscribe his name on every available surface in Egypt. Ramesses II was a warrior king in the tradition of Thutmose III. His most famous military engagement was the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, fought against the Hittite Empire in what is now Syria. The Hittites, a powerful Anatolian empire, had been the most formidable military power in the Near East for over a century. Ramesses II led his army north to fight them for control of Syria and Canaan. The battle was nearly a disaster. Ramesses II had been tricked by false intelligence into advancing ahead of his main army with just one division. The Hittites launched their chariot force into his exposed flank and came close to annihilating him.
What happened next was either a miracle of divine intervention, as Egyptian propaganda insisted, or an extraordinary personal act of courage. Ramesses II apparently rallied his immediate guard, charged into the Hittite chariot force, and fought his way out. Hittite records confirm something went wrong with their attack, though they don't credit any Egyptian heroism. The battle ended in a tactical draw. Ramesses II declared a great victory and had the story inscribed on the walls of virtually every major temple in Egypt: Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, Abydos. The visual propaganda of Ramesses II charging alone in his chariot against the Hittites, bow drawn, enemies falling before him, is one of the most repeated images in Egyptian art. 16 years later, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed the world's first recorded peace treaty, a document so significant that a reproduction hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York today. Ramesses II was also history's most prolific father. He had 8 great wives, including his beloved Nefertari, for whom he built the most exquisite small temple at Abu Simbel, and over 200 secondary wives and concubines. He fathered at least 96 sons and 60 daughters, outliving most of them. His building program was staggering. Abu Simbel's twin temples carved directly into a Nubian cliff face, the Ramesseum, additions to Karnak and Luxor, the city of P. Ramesses in the Delta. He lived to approximately 90 years old, dying peacefully in his bed, which in ancient Egypt was essentially miraculous.
Ramesses II's son, Merneptah, inherited a still powerful Egypt, but storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The Bronze Age world, the network of interconnected civilizations that had made the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East a cosmopolitan trading system for centuries, was beginning to come apart, and the agents of its destruction were a mysterious coalition known only as the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian records beginning around 1208 BC, groups of warriors, migrants, and raiders arriving by sea and land from somewhere in the Aegean and Anatolian worlds. Their origin is still debated. They may have included displaced Mycenaean Greeks, Anatolians fleeing the collapse of the Hittite Empire, and peoples from Cyprus, Sicily, and Sardinia. What is clear from archaeology is that around 1200 BC, the entire Bronze Age world collapsed in a cascade of destruction that annihilated kingdoms and cities across the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's greatest rival and treaty partner, was destroyed completely around 1180 BC. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, ushering in a 4th-century Greek Dark Age. The great trading city of Ugarit in Syria was burned and never rebuilt. Dozens of cities in Canaan were destroyed. The complex trading networks that had sustained Bronze Age civilization were shattered. It was arguably the most catastrophic civilizational collapse in recorded history. Egypt survived, but just barely. Ramesses III, who ruled from roughly 1184 to 1153 BC, fought 2 massive battles against the Sea Peoples, depicted in extraordinary relief carvings at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. His land battle and naval battle against the invaders were apparently successful in stopping them from overrunning Egypt itself. But Egypt's empire in Canaan was gone. The Levantine territories that Egyptian armies had controlled for centuries were lost. Egypt was no longer an empire. It was merely a kingdom, struggling to survive. The reign of Ramesses III ended in further drama: the harem conspiracy, an assassination plot organized by a secondary wife who wanted her own son on the throne.
Court documents from the trial of the conspirators survive and make for extraordinary reading. A judge himself was caught carousing with the conspirators and had his nose and ears cut off. Ramesses III apparently died from the conspiracy. Recent examination of his mummy revealed a deep throat wound that was probably the fatal blow. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a long decline. A succession of pharaohs, all named Ramesses, Ramesses IV through XI, presided over a shrinking, increasingly fragmented state. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were robbed, even ancient ones, with the robbers sometimes being the very workmen tasked with guarding them. Court records of tomb robbery trials survive and read like modern crime reports. The government was too weak to prevent it. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak had grown so powerful that by the end of the 20th dynasty, the high priest of Amun effectively ruled Upper Egypt as a military commander and priest king, while the pharaoh retained nominal sovereignty from his seat in the delta. Egypt was splitting along its ancient fault line. The Third Intermediate Period, roughly 1070 to 664 BC, saw Egypt ruled by competing dynasties based in different cities: Thebes, Tanis, Bubastis, Sais, Memphis. Libyan military commanders who had settled in Egypt as mercenaries established their own dynasties. Nubia, once Egypt's subject territory, produced a dynasty of pharaohs who actually reunified Egypt for a period. The 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs, whose rulers came from the Nubian kingdom of Kush. The Kushite pharaohs, Pi, Shabaka, Taharqa, were devoted to Egyptian culture, perhaps even more deeply than the Egyptians themselves. Taharqa built prolifically at Karnak, restored old temples, and was powerful enough to send an army to support the kingdom of Judah against the Assyrian Empire. A famous passage in the Bible's Book of Kings describes an Assyrian army besieging Jerusalem, withdrawing when it heard that Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, Taharqa, was marching against them. But the Assyrians were the most militarily effective power of the era, and their ambitions extended to Egypt. In the 670s and 660s BC, Assyrian armies under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal invaded and sacked Egypt multiple times, including the unthinkable, the sack of Thebes, the sacred city of Amun, in 663 BC. The Kushite pharaohs retreated south. Egypt's humiliation was complete.
Egypt recovered from the Assyrian invasions under the Saite pharaohs of the 26th dynasty, so called because their capital was Sais in the western delta. The Saite period, roughly 664 to 525 BC, was a remarkable era of Egyptian Renaissance. Looking back nostalgically at the Old and Middle Kingdom as golden ages, the Saite pharaohs consciously revived ancient artistic styles, texts, and religious practices. It was Egypt's own classical revival, a civilization rediscovering and celebrating its own history. Trade flourished. Greek merchants established a colony at Naucratis in the Delta, creating an enclave that became an important cultural bridge between Greece and Egypt. Greek mercenary soldiers served in Egyptian armies. Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and left us the most detailed ancient description of Egyptian culture from an outsider's perspective. He was clearly dazzled and not entirely reliable, mixing genuine observation with wonder and misinformation. But Egypt could not remain independent forever in a world of expanding empires. In 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt with a massive army and conquered it at the Battle of Pelusium. Egypt became a province, a satrapy of the Persian Empire, the first time it had been governed by a foreign power since the Hyksos. Cambyses was deeply unpopular. Egyptian sources depict him as a mad, sacrilegious destroyer of temples, though Persian and some other sources suggest he was more respectful of Egyptian religion than Egyptian propaganda admitted. Egypt revolted from Persian rule repeatedly. Native pharaohs briefly regained independence in the early 4th century BC, in what historians call the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties. The last native Egyptian pharaoh was Nectanebo II, who was eventually driven from Egypt by a second Persian conquest in 343 BC. He reportedly fled to Ethiopia, or possibly, according to legend, to Macedonia, where he fathered Alexander the Great. That last story is certainly myth, but it tells us something about how desperate Egyptians were to believe that even their foreign conquerors had Egyptian blood. The Persian reconquest lasted barely a decade before someone arrived who would be welcomed as a liberator, Alexander the Great of Macedon. Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BC, and the Egyptians welcomed him. After decades of Persian rule, a foreign conqueror who sacrificed to Egyptian gods and respected Egyptian traditions was acceptable. Alexander did more than that. He made a pilgrimage to the Oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis in the western desert, a journey of extraordinary difficulty through hundreds of miles of sand, and was told by the oracle that he was the son of Amun. Alexander found this very congenial. He was already claiming divine parentage. The Egyptian gods confirmed it. Alexander founded a city on the western edge of the Nile Delta, Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. He laid out its grid plan himself, according to legend, scattering grain instead of chalk to mark the streets when he ran out of chalk. Birds ate the grain, which his soothsayers interpreted as an omen of abundance. Alexandria was designed from the beginning as a Mediterranean city, Greek in culture, Egyptian in location, universal in ambition. Alexander left Egypt quickly, pursuing his conquest of the Persian Empire. He died in Babylon in 323 BC at 32 years old, without ever returning. His generals divided his empire in the chaos that followed, the wars of the Diadochi, the successors. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable generals and possibly his childhood friend. Ptolemy stole Alexander's body as it was being transported back to Macedonia and buried it in Alexandria, an act of brilliant political theater that gave him the prestige of the dead conqueror's presence. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt from 323 to 30 BC, 3 centuries of Greek-speaking pharaohs who presented themselves to their Egyptian subjects in pharaonic style and to the Greek world as Hellenistic kings. Alexandria, under the Ptolemies, became the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest library of antiquity, at its peak holding hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was established there. The Museum of Alexandria, the world's first research institution, funded by the pharaoh, attracted the greatest scholars of the age. Euclid developed geometry at Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy at Alexandria. Archimedes may have studied there. Hipparchus developed trigonometry. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced there. For a few centuries, Alexandria was where the world's most advanced thinking happened, and the Ptolemaic pharaohs funded it as a matter of prestige and policy. Let's pause the political narrative and look at what life in ancient Egypt was actually like for ordinary people. Not pharaohs and priests, but farmers, craftsmen, scribes, and servants who made up the vast majority of Egyptian society. Most Egyptians were farmers. They lived in villages of mud brick houses along the Nile, rising before dawn to work their fields, keeping a few animals, growing wheat and barley, vegetables, flax for linen, and papyrus for paper. Their lives were organized by the Nile's annual flood cycle. During the flood season, when their fields were under water, they were available for labor conscription, which is why the pyramids could be built. A government that understood agricultural rhythms could mobilize a massive workforce during the 3 to 4 months when farmers had nothing else to do. Egyptian workers were not slaves, at least not the corvée labor force that built the monuments. They were paid in food. Bread, beer, and onions were the basic ration. Beer was safer to drink than Nile water and provided calories. Bread was the staff of life. Onions had symbolic and practical value. Workers also received linen, oil, and sometimes fish. When payments were late, as surviving records from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village at Thebes, show, the workers went on strike. Egypt has the world's first recorded labor strike around 1159 BC, when the workers at Deir el-Medina marched on the temples demanding their grain rations. Egyptian women in ancient Egypt had more legal rights than in almost any other ancient civilization. They could own property, initiate divorce, serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, conduct business, and inherit. They could not typically hold high political or priestly offices, though exceptions existed, but their economic and legal status was far closer to men's than in Greece, Rome, or most ancient Near Eastern societies. Egyptian love poetry, some of the oldest romantic verse in the world, is full of witty, assertive women who pursue the objects of their affection with cheerful determination. Egyptian childhood was short but not brutal. Children played with toys, spinning tops, wooden horses, dolls with jointed limbs, balls that archaeologists have found in tombs. Cats, the Egyptians' favorite animals, were semi-domesticated and lived in Egyptian households as working mousers and beloved companions. The Egyptians were among the first people to keep cats as pets, and they elevated them to divine status. The goddess Bastet had the head of a cat. Egyptian religion is one of the most complex and fascinating theological systems in human history, a rich, layered accumulation of local traditions, cosmic myths, and practical magic that developed over 3,000 years and never resolved its own contradictions because it never needed to. Egyptian religion was not a systematic theology. It was a living, breathing, constantly evolving relationship between humans and the divine. The Egyptian pantheon included over 2,000 gods and goddesses, from cosmic deities like Ra and Osiris to local gods of individual cities and provinces. Many gods had multiple forms and names. Amun and Ra merged to become Amun-Ra. Horus had dozens of variations: Horus the Elder, Horus the Younger, Horus the Falcon. The same deity could be benevolent in one context and threatening in another. This theological flexibility was not inconsistency, it was deliberate. Egyptian religion understood that the divine was too vast and complex for any single name or form to capture. The most important Egyptian myth was the story of Osiris, the good king murdered by his jealous brother Set, resurrected by his devoted wife Isis, and made king of the dead, while his son Horus avenged him and became king of the living. This myth provided the template for Egyptian kingship.
Every pharaoh was Horus in life and became Osiris in death, and for Egyptian belief in the afterlife. If Osiris could be resurrected, so could every Egyptian who followed the proper rituals. Those proper rituals were elaborate. The most important was mummification, the preservation of the physical body so that the deceased's ka, or spiritual double, would have a home to return to. Egyptian embalming techniques evolved over centuries into a sophisticated procedure lasting 70 days, the removal of internal organs, the desiccation of the body with natron salt, the wrapping in linen bandages, the placement in a coffin or series of nested coffins. Amulets were placed among the wrappings to protect the deceased. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions for navigating the underworld, was often placed in the coffin. The culminating ritual was the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Two Truths, the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Mot, truth, justice, cosmic order. If the heart was light as the feather, if the deceased had lived justly, they were admitted to eternal paradise, the field of reeds, an idealized version of Egypt, with no floods, perfect harvests, and the company of the gods. If the heart was heavier than the feather, a monster called Amit, part lion, part hippo, part crocodile, devoured it, and the deceased ceased to exist.
Egyptian art is instantly recognizable. Figures shown in a composite view with heads in profile, eyes facing forward, shoulders facing front, and feet in profile. Larger figures are more important than smaller ones. Pharaohs tower over their subjects. Gods tower over pharaohs. The same artistic conventions appear on objects from 3000 BC and 300 BC. 3,000 years of extraordinary stylistic consistency, interrupted only briefly by the Amarna period's strange naturalism. This consistency was not stagnation. Egyptian artists within this rigid framework produced works of breathtaking beauty and technical mastery. The wall paintings of Theban tombs with their vivid colors and intimate details of daily life. The portrait sculpture of Old Kingdom officials with their extraordinary realism. The jewelry of Tutankhamun's burial treasure with its complex inlays of carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli. The delicate reliefs of Hatshepsut's temple with their documentary detail of the Punt expedition. Egyptian writing, hieroglyphics, was one of the world's first writing systems, developed around 3200 BC, more or less simultaneously with Mesopotamian cuneiform. Hieroglyphics were sacred writing, the gods' words, the Egyptians called them, used for monumental inscriptions. For administrative purposes, hieroglyphics were simplified into hieratic script, a cursive form. Later still, an even more simplified demotic script developed for everyday use. By the late period, most Egyptians could not read hieroglyphics at all. It had become a specialized skill of the priesthood. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon's soldiers in 1799, now in the British Museum, contains the same text in hieroglyphics, demotic, and Greek. The French scholar Jean-François Champollion used this parallel text to crack the code of hieroglyphics in 1822, after the script had been unreadable for over 1,400 years. His decipherment opened the entire ancient Egyptian world to modern understanding. Suddenly, 3,000 years of inscriptions could be read. Egyptian science and mathematics were practical rather than theoretical. Egyptian mathematicians developed accurate methods for calculating areas and volumes needed for construction. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, dating to around 1550 BC, contains problems and solutions demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. Egyptian doctors were the most skilled in the ancient world. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BC, contains the first documented rational approach to medicine, diagnosing and treating conditions based on observation rather than exclusively on magic. Throughout all 3,000 years of pharaonic history, no relationship was more constant, more complex, or more consequential than Egypt's relationship with Nubia, the territory to the south along the Nile, roughly corresponding to modern Sudan. Egypt and Nubia were neighbors, trading partners, rivals, conquerors and conquered, and profoundly intertwined culturally in ways that shaped both civilizations for millennia. Egyptian interest in Nubia was driven primarily for resources. Nubia, the Egyptians called it Ta Seti, land of the bow, and later Kush, had gold. Enormous quantities of gold, from alluvial deposits in the eastern desert and later from hard rock mines. It also had ivory, ebony, cattle, incense, exotic animals, and, most importantly, control of trade routes to the rest of Africa. Every major Egyptian period of strength saw expansion into Nubia. Every Egyptian period of weakness saw Nubia reasserting independence. The Old Kingdom pharaohs conducted trading expeditions and occasional raids into Nubia. The Middle Kingdom built a chain of massive mud brick fortresses between the First and Second Cataracts, the most extensive fortification system in the ancient world, intended to control the movement of people and goods in both directions. The New Kingdom, emboldened by the military reforms forced on them by the Hyksos, conquered Nubia all the way to the Fourth Cataract and beyond. Nubia under Egyptian rule was not simply occupied, it was Egyptianized. Nubian princes were sent to Egypt to be educated at the royal court. Egyptian temples were built across Nubia. Abu Simbel, built by Ramesses II, deep in Nubian territory, was as much a political statement as a religious building. Nubians adopted Egyptian gods, pharaonic styles, and pyramid burial. When native Egyptian power weakened, it was Nubians who preserved Egyptian civilization most faithfully. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, ruling from around 747 to 656 BC, represent one of history's great ironies, the conquered people becoming the preservers of the conqueror's culture. The pyramids the Kushite rulers built at Meroe in Sudan, steeper and more numerous than Egypt's own, stand today as powerful testimony to how deeply Egyptian civilization had taken root in Nubian soil. Long after Egypt itself became Greek, then Roman, then Christian, the Meroitic kingdom maintained a form of Egyptian religious and artistic tradition.
We now arrive at the end, the last chapter of 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. And it is perhaps the most dramatic end imaginable. A brilliant, multilingual queen maneuvering between two of the most powerful Romans of the age, playing the greatest political chess game of the ancient world, and ultimately losing. Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, the one of the asp and the needle of legend, was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last pharaoh of Egypt. She came to power around 51 BC, ruling jointly with her father, Ptolemy XII, and then with her younger brothers turned husbands, Ptolemy XIII and XIV. She was, unlike most of her Ptolemaic predecessors, fluent in Egyptian. She had also learned to speak 9 languages. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually speak to her Egyptian subjects in their own tongue. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, chasing the fleeing Pompey, Egypt was in the middle of a civil war between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII.
The story of Cleopatra smuggling herself to Caesar, wrapped in a carpet or a sack, has already appeared in our Roman Empire story. Their alliance, their affair, their son Caesarion, and Caesar's murder in 44 BC, all of this we've covered. But after Caesar's death, Cleopatra's story continued. Mark Antony came to power in the East after Caesar's assassination. Cleopatra met him at Tarsus in 41 BC in that legendary golden barge appearance. They fell in love, or formed a political alliance so intimate it became love. The distinction is probably meaningless. Together they ruled the Eastern Mediterranean as co-monarchs of a Hellenistic empire. Antony gave Cleopatra territories, Cyprus, parts of the Levant, portions of Asia Minor. They had 3 children together. But Octavian's propaganda was more powerful than their real achievements. Octavian depicted Antony as a degenerate slave of an Oriental queen, a traitor to Rome, a man who had abandoned his Roman identity. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, won the naval engagement. Cleopatra's fleet fled, and Antony followed. Within a year, Octavian had invaded Egypt. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, mortally wounded himself. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded through Rome as a trophy in Octavian's triumph, ended her own life, according to most ancient sources, by allowing an asp, the Egyptian royal cobra, to bite her. She was 39 years old. Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC, but unlike other Roman provinces, it was governed with extraordinary special status. Augustus treated Egypt as his personal property, essentially. Roman senators were not even permitted to visit without imperial permission. The fear was obvious. Whoever controlled Egypt's grain, which fed a significant portion of the Roman Empire, controlled Rome. Egypt was too important to be an ordinary province. Roman Egypt was enormously productive and remarkably stable. The annual Nile flood continued its reliable rhythms. Grain flowed north to feed Rome. Papyrus provided the empire's paper. The Red Sea ports of Roman Egypt channeled the luxury trade with India and Arabia. Pepper, silk, cotton, ivory, and gems into the Mediterranean economy. Alexandria remained one of the empire's greatest cities, a hub of intellectual and commercial life. Egyptian religion survived and adapted. Roman emperors were depicted as pharaohs in Egyptian temple reliefs. Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Hadrian, all wearing the double crown and offering to Egyptian gods. The cult of Isis, the devoted wife, the magical healer, the great mother, spread throughout the Roman Empire, becoming one of the most popular mystery religions from Britain to Mesopotamia. Many scholars see in the cult of Isis clear parallels to the later veneration of the Virgin Mary. Christianity arrived in Egypt early. Tradition holds that the evangelist Mark founded the Church of Alexandria in the 1st century AD. Egypt became one of early Christianity's most important centers. Alexandria produced some of the greatest Christian theologians: Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Athanasius. The Egyptian desert gave birth to Christian monasticism. The first Christian monks were Egyptian hermits who withdrew from the world to pray in the desert. The Coptic Church, the ancient Christian church of Egypt, still exists today and traces its origin directly to these first Egyptian Christians. The old religion died slowly. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at the Temple of Philae in 394 AD. The last Demotic inscription at the same site dates to 452 AD. The Temple of Isis at Philae,
The last functioning pagan temple in the Roman Empire was finally closed by the Emperor Justinian in 536 AD or 537 AD. By then, Egypt had been Christian for over 2 centuries. The old gods were silent. The 3,000-year conversation with Ra, Osiris, and Amun was over.
Let's take a slow, meditative tour of Egypt's greatest surviving monuments, the physical testimony to 3,000 years of human genius, faith, and ambition. The pyramids of Giza remain the only surviving wonder of the ancient 7 wonders of the world. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the Pyramid of Khafre, and the Pyramid of Menkaure stand on the Giza Plateau on the edge of the desert, just west of modern Cairo. They have been standing for 4,500 years. They will almost certainly outlast everything built in the last 5 centuries. The Great Pyramid was the tallest structure on Earth for 3,800 years, a record that will never be approached. Up close, the individual limestone blocks are larger than a person. The engineering precision is still almost inexplicable. Karnak Temple Complex on the east bank of the Nile at modern Luxor is the largest religious site ever constructed. Building began around 2000 BC and continued for approximately 1,500 years under successive pharaohs, each adding their own contribution. The result is a vast, labyrinthine accumulation of pylons, hypostyle halls, obelisks, sacred lakes, and subsidiary temples covering over 100 hectares. Walking through Karnak is walking through Egyptian history. Each pharaoh's additions like geological strata, the ambitions of Thutmose III and Ramesses II and Amenhotep III, all layered on top of each other. The Valley of the Kings, cut into the limestone cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, was the royal cemetery of the New Kingdom pharaohs. From Thutmose I to Ramesses XI, pharaohs were buried here in increasingly elaborate rock-cut tombs, their walls covered with painted religious texts to guide the royal soul through the underworld. 63 tombs have been discovered. Many were robbed in antiquity, but the valley still holds wonders. Tutankhamun's intact tomb, the vast KV5 tomb of the sons of Ramesses II, and possibly more still undiscovered. Abu Simbel, 2 temples carved directly into a sandstone cliff face in the southmost part of ancient Egypt, deep in what is now Sudan, is perhaps the most dramatic surviving monument from any ancient civilization. The Great Temple features 4 seated colossi of Ramesses II, each 20 meters tall, flanking the entrance. The small temple next to it, built for Ramesses II's wife Nefertari, has 6 standing colossi, unusually 3 of Ramesses and 3 of Nefertari at equal size, a remarkable honor. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s and the rising waters of Lake Nasser threatened to submerge Abu Simbel, UNESCO organized one of the greatest engineering rescues in history, cutting the entire temple complex into 20-ton blocks and reassembling it on higher ground. The temples were saved. Ancient Egypt was essentially invisible to the modern world until the early 19th century. The last person who could read hieroglyphics had died around 400 AD. The temples and tombs were known, they were hard to miss, but their inscriptions were incomprehensible. Egypt was a land of magnificent mysteries that no one could read. Napoleon Bonaparte changed that, accidentally. His 1798 military expedition to Egypt brought not just soldiers, but also 167 scholars, scientists, and artists, the Commission des Sciences et Arts, tasked with documenting everything Egyptian. Their work was published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte, 23 volumes of text and illustrations that introduced Europe to the wonders of Egypt in systematic detail. One of Napoleon's soldiers also found the Rosetta Stone at a town called Rashid in the Delta. The Rosetta Stone's significance was immediately recognized. Here was the same text in 3 scripts, including Greek, which scholars could read. But deciphering the hieroglyphics proved enormously difficult. The breakthrough came in 1822, when the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, a prodigy who had been working on the problem since he was a teenager, cracked the code. He recognized that hieroglyphics were not purely symbolic, but phonetic, that the signs represented sounds, not just ideas. He collapsed in excitement, ran to his brother's office shouting, "I've got it!" and fainted. Champollion's decipherment opened a vast archive. Suddenly, the inscriptions in every temple and tomb could be read. The texts in every coffin and papyrus could be understood. Archaeologists flooded Egypt, British, French, German, Italian, American. Some were genuine scholars, many were treasure hunters. The 19th century saw enormous quantities of Egyptian artifacts leave Egypt for museums and private collections around the world. The greatest discovery came in 1922, when Howard Carter, working for the Earl of Carnarvon, found the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings after years of frustrating excavation. When Carter made the first small hole in the inner chamber doorway and held a candle through it, Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." It is one of the most famous utterances in the history of archaeology. The contents of that tomb, 5,398 objects, including the golden death mask, transformed public understanding of ancient Egyptian wealth and artistry.
Let's take a slow, meditative tour of Egypt's greatest surviving monuments, the physical testimony to 3,000 years of human genius, faith, and ambition. The pyramids of Giza remain the only surviving wonder of the ancient 7 wonders of the world. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the Pyramid of Khafre, and the Pyramid of Menkaure stand on the Giza Plateau on the edge of the desert, just west of modern Cairo. They have been standing for 4,500 years. They will almost certainly outlast everything built in the last 5 centuries. The Great Pyramid was the tallest structure on Earth for 3,800 years, a record that will never be approached. Up close, the individual limestone blocks are larger than a person. The engineering precision is still almost inexplicable. Karnak Temple Complex on the east bank of the Nile at modern Luxor is the largest religious site ever constructed. Building began around 2000 BC and continued for approximately 1,500 years under successive pharaohs, each adding their own contribution. The result is a vast, labyrinthine accumulation of pylons, hypostyle halls, obelisks, sacred lakes, and subsidiary temples covering over 100 hectares. Walking through Karnak is walking through Egyptian history. Each pharaoh's additions like geological strata, the ambitions of Thutmose III and Ramesses II and Amenhotep III, all layered on top of each other. The Valley of the Kings,
cut into the limestone cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, was the royal cemetery of the New Kingdom pharaohs. From Thutmose I to Ramesses XI, pharaohs were buried here in increasingly elaborate rock-cut tombs, their walls covered with painted religious texts to guide the royal soul through the underworld. 63 tombs have been discovered. Many were robbed in antiquity, but the valley still holds wonders. Tutankhamun's intact tomb, the vast KV5 tomb of the sons of Ramesses II, and possibly more still undiscovered. Abu Simbel, 2 temples carved directly into a sandstone cliff face in the southmost part of ancient Egypt, deep in what is now Sudan, is perhaps the most dramatic surviving monument from any ancient civilization. The Great Temple features 4 seated colossi of Ramesses II, each 20 meters tall, flanking the entrance. The small temple next to it, built for Ramesses II's wife Nefertari, has 6 standing colossi, unusually 3 of Ramesses and 3 of Nefertari at equal size, a remarkable honor. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s and the rising waters of Lake Nasser threatened to submerge Abu Simbel, UNESCO organized one of the greatest engineering rescues in history, cutting the entire temple complex into 20-ton blocks and reassembling it on higher ground. The temples were saved. Ancient Egypt was essentially invisible to the modern world until the early 19th century. The last person who could read hieroglyphics had died around 400 AD. The temples and tombs were known, they were hard to miss, but their inscriptions were incomprehensible. Egypt was a land of magnificent mysteries that no one could read. Napoleon Bonaparte changed that, accidentally. His 1798 military expedition to Egypt brought not just soldiers, but also 167 scholars, scientists, and artists, the Commission des Sciences et Arts, tasked with documenting everything Egyptian. Their work was published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte, 23 volumes of text and illustrations that introduced Europe to the wonders of Egypt in systematic detail. One of Napoleon's soldiers also found the Rosetta Stone at a town called Rashid in the Delta. The Rosetta Stone's significance was immediately recognized. Here was the same text in 3 scripts, including Greek, which scholars could read. But deciphering the hieroglyphics proved enormously difficult. The breakthrough came in 1822, when the French scholar Jean-François Champollion, a prodigy who had been working on the problem since he was a teenager, cracked the code. He recognized that hieroglyphics were not purely symbolic, but phonetic, that the signs represented sounds, not just ideas. He collapsed in excitement, ran to his brother's office shouting, "I've got it!" and fainted. Champollion's decipherment opened a vast archive. Suddenly, the inscriptions in every temple and tomb could be read. The texts in every coffin and papyrus could be understood. Archaeologists flooded Egypt, British, French, German, Italian, American. Some were genuine scholars, many were treasure hunters. The 19th century saw enormous quantities of Egyptian artifacts leave Egypt for museums and private collections around the world. The greatest discovery came in 1922, when Howard Carter, working for the Earl of Carnarvon, found the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings after years of frustrating excavation. When Carter made the first small hole in the inner chamber doorway and held a candle through it, Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, "Yes,
wonderful things. It is one of the most famous utterances in the history of archaeology. The contents of that tomb, 5,398 objects, including the golden death mask, transformed public understanding of ancient Egyptian wealth and artistry.
Egypt did not exist in isolation. For 3,000 years, it was the most powerful and prestigious civilization in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, and its influence radiated outward in ways that shaped cultures from Greece to Israel to Rome. The influence on early Greek culture was profound. Ancient Greek writers acknowledged it openly. Herodotus, Plato, Pythagoras, and others all claim to have learned from Egyptian priests. Whether or not these specific claims are true, the archaeological and textual evidence shows clearly that Greek religion, art, and architecture were deeply influenced by Egypt. The Greek kouros statues, standing male figures with one foot forward, arms at sides, are almost identical in pose to Egyptian standing statues. Early Greek temples borrowed Egyptian proportions. Greek mystery religions, with their emphasis on death, resurrection, and initiation, echo Egyptian religious themes. The relationship between Egypt and early Israel is more complex and more contested. The biblical narrative of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt, the story of Joseph, Moses, and the Exodus, does not have clear direct archaeological confirmation, but the cultural background is Egyptian. Moses' name is Egyptian. The 10 plagues echo Egyptian religious concepts. The Ark of the Covenant bears a suspicious resemblance to Egyptian processional shrines. Whether or not the Exodus happened as described, the Israelites knew Egypt intimately, and Egypt knew them. Egyptian obelisks stand today in cities across the world. Rome has more Egyptian obelisks than Egypt does. The Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. is an obelisk. The Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas is a pyramid. The pyramid motif appears on the United States $1 bill, the unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye, borrowed from Masonic symbolism that itself drew on Egyptian esoteric tradition. Egyptian visual language has become part of the global visual vocabulary. The very concept of civilization as a permanent, monumental, writing-based human achievement owes something to Egypt. When later cultures imagined antiquity, they imagined Egypt, immovable, mysterious, ancient beyond reckoning. The pyramids as symbols of timeless human ambition, the Sphinx as symbol of inscrutable mystery, the pharaoh as archetype of absolute power. These images have shaped the human imagination for 2 millennia. Of all the aspects of ancient Egyptian culture that have captured the modern imagination, none has been more consistently fascinating or more misunderstood than mummification. The Egyptian practice of preserving the dead has given us some of the most extraordinary windows into ancient life, and also some of the most lurid mythology. Egyptian mummification was not invented suddenly, but developed over thousands of years. The earliest Egyptians buried their dead in simple desert graves. The hot, dry sand naturally preserved the bodies. When the elite began burying their dead in tombs with offerings away from the desiccating sand, the bodies decayed. Egyptians, seeing the natural preservation of sand-buried bodies as miraculous, developed artificial techniques to replicate it. By the New Kingdom, mummification had become a sophisticated and elaborate procedure. The entire process took 70 days, matching the period Sirius, the most important star in the Egyptian sky, was absent from view each year. Embalmers removed the brain through the nose with a hook.
They removed the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines through an incision in the side, placing them in 4 canopic jars protected by 4 sons of Horus. The heart was left in the body. It was needed for the weighing of the heart judgment. The body was then packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt, for 40 days to dry it completely. It was then wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages, with protective amulets placed at specific points among the wrappings. Modern scientific analysis of mummies has told us extraordinary things about ancient Egyptian health and disease. Mummies show evidence of arthritis, dental decay, heart disease, and cancer, including, remarkably, colon cancer in a mummy over 2,000 years old. Studies of royal mummies have revealed family relationships. DNA analysis has identified Tutankhamun's parents and grandparents. Imaging of Ramses II's mummy shows severe arthritis that must have caused him considerable pain in his final years, his spine badly curved. He was probably around 5 feet 7 inches tall, tallish for his era, with red hair. The Victorian-era practice of mummy unwrapping parties, social events where mummies were publicly unwrapped for entertainment, destroyed an incalculable amount of irreplaceable information. Mummies were also ground up and sold as medicine, mummy powder, for centuries in Europe. The word mummy itself comes from the Arabic mumia, meaning bitumen or pitch, because Europeans incorrectly believed Egyptian mummies were preserved with tar. What they were preserved with was natron, linen, and extraordinary craft.
No civilization in human history has been more obsessed with death and the afterlife than ancient Egypt. And understanding why helps explain so much about their culture, their art, their monuments, and their values. For the Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a transition, a difficult, dangerous transition that required careful preparation and powerful magic, but a transition to something better. The eternal afterlife in the field of reeds was an idealized Egypt. Perfect harvests, no flooding, reunion with loved ones who had died, the company of the gods themselves. To reach it, you had to navigate the underworld successfully, pass the weighing of the heart, and have your name remembered by the living. That last requirement, having your name remembered, explains the monumental inscriptions, the massive tombs, the portraits in stone, the offering chapels where the living brought food to feed the dead's ka. Writing a person's name kept them alive. Destroying a person's name, damnatio memoriae, as the Romans later called it, was annihilation. This is why the erasure of Akhenaten's and Tutankhamun's names was so devastating by Egyptian standards. It was attempted murder of the soul. The preparation for death began while one was very much alive. Wealthy Egyptians spent years and enormous resources building and decorating their tombs. The Theban noble tombs on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, some of the most beautiful painted spaces in the ancient world, were built and decorated over decades. The Book of the Dead, customized for each individual with their name inserted into the spells, was commissioned and paid for during one's lifetime. Interestingly, the Egyptians were not gloomy about all this. Their tomb paintings are full of life, feasting scenes, music and dancing, hunting and fishing, husband and wife shown in affectionate poses. Death was not something to be feared, it was something to be prepared for. And the life depicted in the tomb paintings was the life you hoped to enjoy forever. Death was not the opposite of life. Death was life's continuation, its perfected form. Over 3,000 years of history, hundreds of individuals bore the title of pharaoh. Let's revisit the ones who shaped Egypt most fundamentally. Khufu, Cheops, built the Great Pyramid, the most ambitious construction project in human history. Almost nothing of his personality survives. His only confirmed portrait is a tiny 7.5-centimeter ivory figurine discovered in 1903 at Abydos. The man who built the world's most massive monument is almost entirely unknown to us. We have the pyramid, we have almost nothing else. The contrast between the scale of his achievement and the absence of personal record is one of history's great ironies. Thutmose III was Egypt's Napoleon, the greatest conqueror, the finest general, the administrator of genius who turned military victory into lasting empire. 17 campaigns in 20 years, a record of victories at Megiddo, Kadesh, Carchemish, the annals at Karnak, the most detailed military record of any ancient campaign. He transformed Egypt from a powerful kingdom into a genuine superpower. He was also apparently a petty man in one respect. The 20-year campaign to erase Hatshepsut's memory began under him. Akhenaten was the great disruptor, the revolutionary who tried to change everything and whose changes were reversed so completely that he was erased from history. But his ideas, monotheism, naturalistic art, the intimate relationship between God and worshipped, left traces that may have influenced religious thought far beyond Egypt's borders. Whether the connection to Hebrew monotheism is direct or indirect, Akhenaten was thinking thoughts that the ancient world was not ready for. Ramesses II had the longest meaningful reign, the greatest propaganda machine, and the most enduring monuments. He was vain, self-promoting, and possibly not as great a general as he claimed. Kadesh was a near disaster turned into legendary victory by outstanding spin. But he was an extremely effective ruler who maintained Egypt's power for over 60 years and whose monuments still dominate the Egyptian landscape. When European explorers first encountered his massive statues at Abu Simbel, they understood immediately why Shelley wrote Ozymandias, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."
No ancient civilization intersects more intriguingly with the Hebrew Bible and through it with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam than Egypt. The biblical narrative is saturated with Egypt. Abraham takes refuge there during a famine. Joseph is sold into Egyptian slavery and rises to become Pharaoh's chief minister. The Israelites labor in Egypt until Moses leads them out in the Exodus. The Pharaoh of the Exodus pursues them to the Red Sea. Jesus and his family flee to Egypt to escape Herod. Egypt is everywhere. But archaeology has consistently struggled to find direct evidence for the biblical narrative of the Israelite sojourn and Exodus. No Egyptian source mentions the Israelites as a large group of slaves. No plausible historical candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus has been definitively identified, though Ramesses II is the most popular theory in popular culture. The 2 to 3 million people the Bible describes leaving Egypt would have devastated the Egyptian economy and left enormous archaeological traces that have not been found. Most serious historians and archaeologists today believe the Exodus story as described in the Bible, 600,000 fighting men plus women, children, and elderly, totaling perhaps 2 to 3 million people, is not historically accurate as a literal account. Some scholars suggest a smaller historical kernel, perhaps a few thousand Semitic laborers in the Delta who escaped Egyptian authority and whose experience was later amplified into a national founding myth. Others see it as primarily theological narrative rather than historical record. None of this diminishes the story's extraordinary cultural power. The Exodus narrative, slavery, liberation, divine intervention, the journey to the Promised Land, has been the foundational story of Jewish identity for over 2,000 years.
It inspired African American spirituals during the era of slavery in America. It informed Martin Luther King Jr.'s rhetoric in the civil rights movement. It is one of the most powerful narratives in human history, regardless of its precise historical basis. What is clear is that the ancient Israelites knew Egypt extremely well, its gods, its culture, its geography. The biblical writers describe Egyptian practices with accuracy that suggests deep familiarity. Whether that familiarity came from a large-scale sojourn, from smaller groups of Semitic migrants moving back and forth, or from the simple geographic proximity of Canaan to Egypt, the biblical world and the Egyptian world were deeply intertwined. The most underrated question in Egyptian history is not why Egypt eventually fell. It's why Egypt lasted so extraordinarily long. 3,000 years of continuous civilization. No other ancient state comes close. Why? Geography played the first and most fundamental role. The Nile Valley, surrounded by desert, was both extraordinarily productive and extraordinarily defensible. The deserts were not merely inconvenient for invaders, they were lethal. To reach Egypt, an army had to cross vast empty wastes where water and food were almost non-existent. Egypt had time to see them coming and prepare. Until the development of large-scale cavalry warfare and fast-moving armies, the Egyptian heartland was essentially impregnable. The Nile's reliable flood cycle created the second pillar, economic stability. Egypt's agriculture was more reliably productive than almost any other region in the ancient world. Famines happened. The first intermediate period was partly driven by one, but the basic productivity of the Nile Valley made Egypt wealthy year after year. That wealth supported the state, the army, the bureaucracy, the temple establishments, and the labor force for monumental building. The third pillar was ideological, divine kingship. The pharaoh was not just a political ruler, he was the cosmic guarantor of order. Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic harmony flowed from the pharaoh's correct performance of his divine duties, offering to the gods, building their temples, leading the army, governing justly. When things went wrong, drought, famine, invasion, it was interpreted not as evidence that the system was broken, but as evidence that the current pharaoh had failed, requiring replacement or reform. The system itself was never questioned. This ideological resilience was extraordinary. Finally, Egypt survived because of its remarkable capacity for cultural absorption. Every conqueror, Hyksos, Kushite, Assyrian, Persian, Macedonian, Roman, was eventually absorbed or at least adapted to by Egyptian culture. Ptolemaic Greek pharaohs built Egyptian temples. Roman emperors wore the double crown in Egyptian reliefs. Even today, the Coptic Church of Egypt preserves liturgical language directly descended from the ancient Egyptian tongue. Egypt was conquered many times. Egypt was never really destroyed.
The modern world's love affair with ancient Egypt is one of the strangest and most enduring cultural phenomena of the past 2 centuries. From the moment Napoleon's expedition published the Description de l'Égypte and Champollion cracked the hieroglyphic code, ancient Egypt has exercised an almost hypnotic fascination over Western culture. The 19th century saw Egyptonia sweep through art, architecture, and fashion. Egyptian revival architecture produced obelisk-shaped buildings, sphinx-flanked gateways, and pyramid-topped structures from London to New York. Egyptian motifs appeared on furniture, wallpaper, jewelry, and fabrics. Writers and poets became obsessed with Egypt. John Keats never visited but wrote about it. Théophile Gautier wrote a novel about an Egyptologist who falls in love with a mummified princess, a fantasy that somehow still resonates. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 triggered a second wave of Egyptonia, even more intense than the first. Art Deco, the dominant design style of the 1920s and 1930s, was deeply influenced by Egyptian geometric forms and the excitement of the discovery. Egyptian motifs appeared on cinema palaces, skyscrapers, jewelry, and fashion. Lonnie Chaney's The Mummy in 1932 created a horror genre that has never quite died. Contemporary Egyptology is a sophisticated scientific discipline combining archaeology, Egyptology, chemistry, genetics, remote sensing, and digital imaging to extract extraordinary amounts of information from ancient sites and objects. Recent years have seen remarkable discoveries: new tombs in the Valley of the Kings, new settlements buried under the Nile Delta silt, satellite imaging revealing ancient road networks invisible from the ground. A complete new ancient city was discovered near Luxor in 2021, sealed under sand for over 3,000 years, its streets and workshops intact. Egypt's modern government has made ancient heritage central to national identity and economic policy. The Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza finally opened to the public in recent years after decades of construction, is designed to be the largest archaeological museum in the world, displaying over 100,000 objects, including the complete treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb. Egypt's ancient past is not dead, it is very much alive. In the museums, in the tourist sites, in the national imagination, and in the global fascination that 3,000 years of extraordinary civilization still commands. Let's take stock of what ancient Egypt actually contributed to human civilization. Not just the pyramids and mummies that everyone knows, but the deeper gifts that live on in unexpected places. Paper. The word paper comes from papyrus, the reed plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta and from which Egyptians made a writing surface as early as 3000 BC. Papyrus scrolls were exported throughout the ancient world. The Book of the Dead, the medical papyri, the love poetry, the administrative records, the literary masterpieces, all written on papyrus. Egypt's invention made long-distance, large-scale written communication possible in the ancient world. The calendar. The Egyptian civil calendar of 365 days, 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 extra days, was the most accurate and practical calendar of the ancient world. Julius Caesar's calendar reform, creating the Julian calendar that Europe used for 1,600 years, was based explicitly on the Egyptian calendar, developed with the help of the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes. Our own Gregorian calendar is a modification of the Julian. Every time you write a date, you are using a system that descends from ancient Egypt. Geometry. Egyptian mathematicians developed practical geometry to resurvey field boundaries after each Nile flood washed away property markers. The word geometry literally means earth measurement, measuring Egypt's fields. Egyptian knowledge of geometric principles was transmitted to Greece, where it became theoretical mathematics. Euclid worked in Alexandria. The geometry in your high school textbook traces a line back to Egyptian surveyors measuring flooded fields. The idea of monumental permanence. The Egyptians were, as far as we know, the first people to deliberately build structures intended to last forever, not just large, but permanent, made of stone, designed to survive time itself.
The pyramids are not just impressive engineering feats, they are a statement about human ambition, the desire to leave something behind that outlasts individual mortality. Every human civilization that builds in stone, every cathedral, every monument, every war memorial is doing something the Egyptians invented. The belief that great deeds deserve great memorials is Egypt's deepest gift to human culture.
Ancient Egypt lives in the modern imagination in ways that no other ancient civilization quite matches. Rome is admired, Greece is revered, Mesopotamia is respected by specialists, but Egypt is loved with a kind of irrational devotion that transcends historical interest. Why? Partly it is the monuments, the sheer impossible scale of them, still standing after 4,000 years, dwarfing everything modern civilization has produced in terms of physical permanence. Partly it is the mystery, the hieroglyphics that were unreadable for 1,400 years, the tombs sealed and forgotten for millennia, the faces of pharaohs staring out of golden masks across 4,000 years. Partly it is the death obsession. There is something both terrifying and comforting about a civilization that prepared so carefully, so beautifully, for what comes after. Hollywood has given us Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor's iconic 1963 film cost so much it nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. It gave us The Mummy, both the classic horror version and the action-adventure 1999 Brendan Fraser version that spawned a franchise. The Prince of Egypt, DreamWorks' 1998 animated Moses film, is a genuine masterpiece. Night at the Museum, Stargate, Assassin's Creed, Egypt appears again and again as a setting for imagination and adventure. The Internet has its own Egyptian obsession: hieroglyphic translators, virtual tours of tombs, 3D reconstructions of Karnak and Abu Simbel, YouTube channels with hundreds of millions of views devoted entirely to ancient Egypt. The discovery of new tombs or royal mummies consistently makes global news. When researchers successfully decoded ancient papyri using multispectral imaging, the world paid attention. When Zahi Hawass, Egypt's flamboyant former minister of antiquities, the Indiana Jones of real Egyptology, announced a discovery, the world listened. There is something about Egypt that speaks to something deep in human psychology. The pyramids tell us that humans can create things that outlast mortality. The mummies tell us that the desire to continue, to persist, to not be forgotten is universal. The stories of pharaohs, their ambitions, their wars, their loves, their failures, remind us that even the most powerful people in the world are human, mortal, and temporary. Sic transit gloria mundi. And yet the Sphinx still watches the sunrise. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the first agricultural communities beside the Nile 7,000 years ago to the last hieroglyphic inscription in 394 AD. We have watched a civilization rise from mud brick villages to the pyramids, from a unified kingdom to an empire stretching from Sudan to Syria, from divine god kings to the last desperate political chess of Cleopatra and her asp. What does Egypt mean? Not what it meant to the Egyptians, but what it means to us, looking back across such an impossible distance of time. Egypt means patience. A civilization that took 3,000 years to complete cannot be understood quickly or easily. Its rhythms were the rhythms of the Nile, slow, reliable, returning. Egyptian culture changed at glacial pace.
The same artistic conventions, the same religious ideas, the same hieroglyphic script persisted for century after century. There is something almost meditative about Egyptian history. It does not rush. It breathes slowly. And tonight, as you listen to this story, maybe that's not a bad thing. Egypt means ambition. Every pyramid is an act of defiance against mortality, an insistence that human achievement can outlast human flesh. The Egyptians looked at the desert and said, "We will build here something that will stand forever." They were not wrong. The pyramids are still there. They will probably outlast everything we have built in the last 1,000 years. The ambition to leave something permanent is one of the most human impulses there is.
Egypt means mystery. For all we know about ancient Egypt, and we know an extraordinary amount thanks to the hieroglyphic decipherment and 200 years of archaeology, the gaps are enormous. We do not know for certain who the Sphinx was built for or when. We do not know what happened to Nefertiti's body. We do not know how, precisely, the pyramid blocks were raised. We do not know what Akhenaten really believed, or whether he was a visionary or a tyrant. The mystery that has always drawn people to Egypt is still there. Egypt gives up its secrets slowly. It always has. And that, dear listeners, brings us to the end of our journey through ancient Egypt. From the she-wolf of the Nile's first flooded fields, through the god pharaohs and their impossible pyramids, through conquest and collapse, and the slow transformation of a civilization that refused to fully die. 2 hours, 3,000 years, one river, one remarkable, astonishing, endlessly fascinating civilization that gave us paper and geometry and the calendar and the idea of building something that lasts forever. We missed enormous amounts, as we always do. We didn't cover the full story of Egyptian mathematics and astronomy in the depth it deserves. We didn't tell the story of Egyptian music, which we know existed from the many depictions of musicians in tomb paintings, but which, unlike the visual art and the literature, left no direct physical trace. We didn't explore the full complexity of Egyptian provincial life, the dozens of cities up and down the Nile, each with their own local gods, their own traditions, their own stories. But I hope you leave tonight with something more than you had before, a sense of Egypt as a living civilization, not just a collection of impressive ruins and golden treasures. Real people built those pyramids, and they left graffiti about their work gangs. Real scribes copied those texts, and sometimes they doodled in the margins. Real pharaohs made terrifying decisions and tried to control the cosmic order of the universe, and sometimes they failed spectacularly. Real women navigated a world that gave them more legal rights than Greece, but still concentrated ultimate power in men's hands, and some of them, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Cleopatra, claimed that power anyway. This has been Boring History at Sleep. If you made it to the end of a 2-hour deep dive into ancient Egypt, you are exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. Sweet dreams, history lovers. The Nile is still out there, still flowing north, still depositing that dark, rich, endlessly fertile silt on its banks. The Sphinx is still watching the sunrise, and the pyramids are still, impossibly, standing. Good night.